Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. It's an absolute pleasure to be chatting with Mike Regan today. We've previously done a podcast on automated vehicles. In fact, one of the very first podcasts that we recorded on the HFE Hub. And today, Mike is joining us to talk about driver distraction. So thank you for your time once again.
Well, thank you, Sharon. It's great to be back again, and you did such a professional job last time. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you. So let's jump into this question about driver distraction. And firstly, can I ask, what experience do you have in vehicle design?
Well, I've got no direct experience because I'm not a vehicle designer, but as you well know, I've been doing human factors and road safety research that's influenced vehicle design for probably close to 30 years now. I've worked with Ford in Australia and GM Holden here in Australia, looking at vehicle design issues, and more specifically for GM Holden, looking at ways to design the HMI in their vehicles to minimise distraction. I've developed for other clients and organisations distraction assessment protocols and checklists. I've sat for many years on an ISO committee that was all about ergonomics as applied to the design of the HMI and road vehicles. I've sat on a transportation research board committee for a number of years that is also exactly concerned with that same topic. And I created, when I was working in France back in 2009, a biennial international conference series called the International Conference on Driver Distraction and Inattention, and that brings pretty much all of Europe's and some American vehicle manufacturers along to understand, what the current developments are in the area and how research can influence the design of their vehicles. So I've covered pretty much all of the areas that are the areas that have influenced vehicle design from a human factors perspective during my career, and I'll talk a bit about what others have done during the podcast.
So there's been a lot of chat lately about driver distraction in the media. So what is it?
Well, lots of people have defined it in different ways. It's simply diverting your attention fundamentally from the activities that you're performing when you're driving to some other activity. And the other activity might be something like, texting on a mobile phone. It might be, looking at an advertising billboard. It could be any of a number of things, and it can include things that you see outside the vehicle and interact with by, for example, looking at an advertising billboard. It could be anything that's inside the vehicle, as I said, which could be looking at a touchscreen display, touching it, listening to what comes out of it. So it's really that diversion of attention away from driving towards a competing activity. And I did actually develop a technical definition of what it is back in 2009 when I wrote the first book actually on driver distraction with two colleagues, Dr. Christy Young from here in Australia and Professor John Lee from the University of Wisconsin. And we defined it as the diversion of attention away from activities critical for safe driving toward a competing activity. So it's been cited about 1,237 times. So it's used often in the literature, but it's really fundamentally that diversion of attention away from driving. And the things that divert your attention can be driving related or non-driving related. So we think about infotainment systems and things like that distracting us. But if you're in an unfamiliar car and an unexpected or unfamiliar warning goes off, or all of a sudden, if it's got vehicle automation, it takes control of the vehicle, that can be both scary and distracting at the same time. So And if you're driving along and you're looking for navigational landmarks and looking at street signs and they're missing or numbers are missing, on buildings that you're looking for, that can be very distracting, and that's a driving-related activity. So I just want to make that point that things can be inside or outside the vehicle. They may or may not be driving-related, and sometimes you have no control over distraction. Things just can capture your attention involuntarily. How often have you been driving along and you see some person driving along aggressively weaving in and out of traffic? I mean, that's really distracting. It just grabs your attention in what we call a bottom-up fashion, and you've got no control over it, really.
Is it always things that you see?
No, there are many things that can, many ways in which, and it's a good question, there are many ways in which you can be distracted. Things that you can see, like an advertising billboard, can distract you. Things that you can hear. What are the things that you hear that distract you when you're driving, for example?
If I was travelling with my grandchildren in the car, it would be the noise from the back seat. If it was, if I'm just talking about things generally, yeah, I'm definitely distracted by people driving poorly, and I am distracted by sirens. I'm always looking for those and trying to work out where they are.
Well, that's the one I had in mind, and that's a very good one too, because one form of distraction or one modality of distraction, like hearing an ambulance, can then lead to visual distraction, because then you're looking for it, and then that can lead to what we call cognitive distraction, which is, we'll talk about it later, but then you start thinking about what it is that's going on and where you need to position your vehicle to avoid a collision with an ambulance. So something like that can be very distracting. But back to your point, so you can feel things that distract you, like a tyre blowout if you're driving. If your engine's burning, you can smell it, and that's very distracting. If you're eating a hamburger or a rotten apple or something like that, the taste can suddenly divert your attention from driving to wanting to get it out of your mouth because it tastes so terrible. And then finally, and importantly, internal things going on in your head can be distracting. We know from research that people mind wander for probably more than half of the time that they're driving. So they're thinking about stuff. They could be thinking about what they're going to buy at the supermarket. They could be thinking about a job interview they've got to go to. So internal things are also sources of distraction.
So if we know what distraction is, what is safe driving, or what activities assist safe driving?
Well, it's the usual sort of things. Things like complying with traffic signs and signals. These are the activities that, if you perform them appropriately, and you're often trained to do them appropriately, will save you from having a collision and keep you safe. Things like responding to, the actions of vehicles that may be in front, responding to other vehicles that might be on a collision path, maintaining, the right lane position, especially identifying hazards in the roadway, maintaining a proper speed, and giving yourself enough time to stop and brake in an emergency. So there are a whole lot of things that we have to do to stay safe, and the distraction that I've been talking about basically has four consequences. When we get distracted, as I said, we divert our attention, and that takes our mind off the road, and people often call that cognitive distraction. It can take our eyes off the road because, as I said, if you hear the ambulance, you then look for it, and that takes your eyes off the road. Or if there's an advertising billboard there, you take your eyes off the road and look at it. People often don't talk about the fact that your ears can be off the road. So if you're thinking about something and talking to someone on a phone, and let's say it's an emotional discussion, deep and meaningful, often you won't hear what is going on around you. We've all had that experience. We're engaged in watching TV or something, and our partner says to us, "Hey, where's the olive oil?" And you don't even hear them because you're so engrossed in what you're doing. And then, of course, if you're distracted by a mobile phone or something like that, it can take a hand off the steering wheel to hold it if you're actually holding it illegally. So they're the main mechanisms by which those activities that are safety critical can be impacted. Because if you take your eyes off the road or your mind off the road, you might not even see traffic signals or register that they're there or respond to them in the appropriate amount of time. And a lot of the research that's been done in distraction has been focused on exactly that, understanding what are the impacts of those four things: eyes off road, mind off road, ears off road, and hand off the steering wheel, in terms of how they impact those activities that are so safety critical.
So how do they impact us?
That's a good question, because they do it in different ways and people probably don't quite understand the subtleties of it. When we take our eyes off the road, for example, and all of this actually is meaningful, what I'm talking about at the moment, in making sense of how people in our community have actually influenced vehicle design. So, but I'll go through it quickly though. But if we take our eyes off the road, we could miss a traffic sign or signal at a critical time, and all the things I'll mention have been proven to occur through research, mainly in driving simulators, but also in real vehicles. If your eyes are off the road at the wrong time, you could react. Your reaction time will be longer to, let's say, a braking lead vehicle, because you didn't register that it was actually braking because your eyes were elsewhere. You can experience things like change blindness. So there are subtle changes that are happening as you're driving along that you miss because your eyes aren't focusing on that change at the right time. And next minute you turn around and you have a crash with the vehicle in front. Lane keeping is influenced by taking your eyes off the road. How many times have you reached over to the glove box to find that you're looking at the glove box, the next minute you drive off to the left-hand side of the road? It's those sort of things that I think most of us are used to experiencing if we're distracted. And then you get other things that are more subtle, like gaze concentration. So when you return your eyes to the road after they've been away from the road, what you find is that initially it's almost like you've got tunnel vision. It takes you a while to see around you what's happening, and so that's dangerous. So if you, especially have had your eyes off the road for a long time, you might not see pedestrians that might be approaching from side streets or cars and that sort of stuff, and you'll miss them. So
you talk about cognitive distraction. So what's the difference there?
Okay, cognitive distraction is what I was referring to as mind off the road. So that's when you've got your attention off the road. It's one thing to have your eyes off the road, but it's another thing when you've got your mind off the road, even if your eyes are on the road. And so if you're engaged in a, let's say, as I said, an intensive telephone discussion, hands-free, and you've got your eyes on the road, it doesn't mean that you're safe. And so a lot of research has found that if you've got your mind off the road and it's in la la land, or it's occupied with talking to someone, people tend to take longer to react to things, or even not react at all. There's actually an effect called inattention blindness, and I've explored this in my research, such that if you're engaged in a heavy conversation with someone, hands-free, a pedestrian might pull out behind a parked car, and we can prove with an eye tracker that they're looking at that person, but they don't respond. And if they do respond, they respond late. And that's a really serious implication of having your mind off the road. But there are other things too that I think many of us, or many of our listeners, would have experienced, things like making navigation errors and missing a turn off on a freeway because you were chatting away with your passenger or on the phone. Having more variable speed when you're driving. People make fewer lane changes when they're cognitively distracted, probably compensating for the fact that they're not so, they know they're not so good at doing that when they're really distracted. So that's probably a good thing. There are more speeding violations and red light running, and they make more errors fundamentally. So you get these visual effects and you get these more cognitive effects that occur, and all of these things induced by distraction and resulting in these activities critical for safe driving being affected. One of the things I might just mention is that generally it's activities like texting on a handheld phone that take your eyes off the road and your mind off the road and a hand off the steering wheel that are most dangerous, because they sort of bring together all of these different mechanisms of distraction, and especially having your eyes off the road and having them off the road for a long period of time, especially for more than 2 seconds or more than 2 seconds in total in a period of around 6 seconds, is particularly dangerous. So as I say to students, when you're driving along, if you take your eyes off the road, count kangaroo 1, and by the time you've counted kangaroo 1, you should have your eyes back on the road. If you count to kangaroo 2, it could be that you'll miss something and have a crash.
So how significant is this problem? Obviously, it's been talked about a lot. We've had lots of changes in vehicle design. So some of the things you've mentioned have been put into the vehicles as well, which is not helpful. What is the size of the problem?
That's a good question, and it depends on how the data are collected and analysed, and by whom, in fact. If you look at normal police-reported data, probably the best data we have is from the United States and Norway, where they analysed, thousands of police reports in which distraction was considered to be a contributing factor. And they found about 8% of crashes were due to distraction as a contributing factor, because we know that normally no crash, involves just distraction. Crashes are sort of, as we know from the work of Reason and others, there are multiple factors normally contribute to a crash. But in terms of the main contributing factor and the last one that seemed to sort of occur in the crash causation chain, about 8%. But then if you analyse data that's been extracted from reports of what we call in-depth crash investigations, where you get, let's say, a human factors person, a medical doctor, a police officer, a collection of other people, engineers, traffic engineers, as a bunch of experts going out and actually interviewing people, looking at police records and getting all of the data they can. And then we find from at least a couple of studies in Australia that that's a factor in about 15% of crashes. Because don't forget that when police go out there and try to find out what's going on, if people are deliberately distracting themselves, they won't admit that to the police. So there's a sort of an under-reporting of distraction as a problem. And then the final way in which we can collect distraction data is through what we call naturalistic driving studies. And I set one of these up when I was working at the University of New South Wales, in fact, with a colleague you well know, Professor Anne Williamson, and another colleague, a traffic engineering specialist, Professor Raf Shebieta. And we instrumented 350 cars in Victoria and New South Wales with cameras and sensors, accelerometers, yaw sensors. And for 3 or 4 months, we could record exactly sort of second by second what they were doing and see what they were doing and see what was happening outside the vehicle. And another study like this was conducted a few years later with 3,500 people. So a much larger study. And what they found was that 70% of all crashes had distraction as a major contributing factor. And they could establish that because they could actually see what people were doing in the car, and they could correlate that with exactly what happened. And they had about about 920 crashes, I think. So 70% of the 920 crashes were directly attributable to distraction. So it depends on how you measure it. So it's a big problem. That's the answer. It's a huge problem, actually. And you think of the last time you had a crash, or nearly had a crash. In my case, it happened because I was either distracted or inattentive and something unexpected happened. And that's normally what happens to people who are experienced drivers, unlike younger drivers who, are more easily distracted and can't manage the distraction. But even those of us who can, at times we slip, and that's why it's such a big problem.
How do we not become distracted? Or what do we do about the fact that we get distracted?
Distraction can be bad, or it can actually work for you.
Oh, okay.
So we know that truck drivers, for example, and others on boring trips will deliberately distract themselves by talking to people because it raises their general level of arousal and alertness and vigilance. That's the term you used. So I wasn't going to go down that path, but in the first book that I wrote, Anne Williamson actually wrote quite a good chapter on that, about the relationship between those two, the two issues. So it's a two-edged sort of sword. So we all know that if we listen to podcasts on a long trip, if we chat to a passenger, we know through research that this can actually enhance our performance. That's not to say you want to do that indefinitely, because if you're tired, you should take a break. But in between, it's a good strategy.
So tell me what some of the features are of modern vehicle designs that can increase driver distraction.
Look, there are quite a few of them, and some people won't realise that some of the features, even in not so modern vehicles, have been the subject of distraction research in the past by people in our community, human factors and ergonomics researchers and practitioners. So what do you think might have been one of the first things that people might have thought about as a distraction in cars?
I would have thought the screens, when the screens turned up, and multifunction things, or the screens have those multifunction buttons. They're the things that I think are highly distracting.
Yeah, look, you're certainly right. But if we go back to the 1920s, it was actually windscreen wipers.
It wasn't there then.
Well, either was I. It was I that I sometimes feel I was there. Some days I do feel that. But back in the 1920s, when they came in, there was a lot of debate about whether they would distract people, and that encouraged human factors research to prove that it was okay. People could actually cut through the wipers and focus on those activities critical for safe driving that I talked about. Then the next thing that came to their attention was radios. So radios were introduced in the 1930s. It was a big thing, Well, prior to that, the only thing you had any interaction with was a human or an animal in the car, and now you're sitting there listening to people talking to you. So that was a big deal. And so it took a while to realise that radios, if you're listening to them, and if you could tune the volume and change frequencies without sort of looking at the radio, they proved it wasn't a problem. It was acceptable. And in fact, it's interesting we're talking about this because interacting with the radio in that way is now still used in the year 2026 as a benchmark for determining whether other things that people do in the vehicle are acceptable. So manufacturers, if you speak to them, will say to people in their human factors design departments, will say, yeah, well, when we do research, we often use as a baseline level of distraction the distraction that would be induced by using a radio in that way. And then the next thing that came along was 8-track tape players back in the 1970s. We all remember the cassettes we used to stick in. If we're old enough, you might not be old enough.
I do.
I confess I was old enough. And then, of course, mobile phones came in the 80s. But when they came in, of course, all we could do was talk on them. But then they became smart, and they became the next wave of things that were really distracting that we brought into the vehicle, because then apps were developed, and the iPhone was a total game changer, as we all well know. So talking about modern features, there are a lot of infotainment features, we call them, that are built into the vehicle, like phones. So manufacturers will, through their inbuilt menu, allow you to phone people. Some of them will allow you to send texts while the vehicle's in motion. It varies between manufacturers to find music, to navigate. And so they're all accessed these days through touchscreens in the car. But infotainment features can also be accessible in modern cars with these sort of wireless interfaces like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Have you got one of those in your car, Sharon?
I certainly do.
Yeah, I've got Apple CarPlay in mine, and as you well know, they allow the some of the apps on the phone to be displayed on the touchscreen, and you can interact with them to do the same thing. You know, send text messages, make phone calls, listen to podcasts. You interact with them through the touchscreen, and more of these features are becoming available, as I'll talk about shortly. This creates a whole new range of problems that hadn't been anticipated, really, because we all thought that the answer to, people using mobile phones hands-free was to have an interface like this that would mean you've got stuff on a screen. But what are you doing now? You're still having to touch it, still having to go through multiple menus, even in some cases, as we'll talk about. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there are some very important safety features in modern cars that we call advanced driver assistance systems. And they issue warnings like lane departure warnings. They can even take control of the vehicle if it veers out of its lane. And they also have things like autonomous emergency braking, so the car will automatically issue an alert if you're going to collide with a pedestrian or an object, and if you don't react, the car will respond for you. And I've actually evaluated many of those systems during my career, experimentally and in real cars here and in Europe. And if you, and they're vitally important. I've proven, and others have proven, that they improve safety and they save lives. But if you don't understand how they work and they intervene when unexpected, they're very distracting. And if they're poorly designed, in fact, and if the timing of the warnings isn't right, then accidents have been, crashes have been created by the systems themselves. So this is where human factors, again, is so critically important.
So let's talk a little bit more maybe about, we've talked a fair bit about the touch screens. I was actually going to ask a question, and that was, I've got Apple CarPlay, and occasionally, I might want to have my phone play something. So I will set an audio request. It usually gets it wrong, by the way, but I ask it to play a certain track or a certain album, or find directions to a certain place, or even I've asked it to open a podcast before. And some of the times it's great and it does it, but of course there are times where it doesn't. And then, as you say, you're left with a screen that you're either going to interact with or you'd have to pull over and use it. I don't know whether you've thought about that.
The issue you're raising is an important one, and it's all about voice control instead of having to interact manually with touchscreens. And if you have a look at most modern vehicles that do have these large central touchscreens, which are, I think I'm trying to point out, are actually quite dangerous. Everyone thought that voice control would be the thing that would solve the problem, so you don't have to touch the screen. Like in a Tesla, for example, you can use your voice to say open the glove box. Before you do that, you've got to touch a little button on the steering wheel to register that you're about to give a voice command. If you don't do that and do it visually manually, you've actually got it's a three-step process using the touchscreen, which, as I said, takes your eyes off the road, a hand off the wheel, and your mind off the road. Using your voice is generally going to be less distracting than a visual manual interaction. But as one of my colleagues who I've collaborated with quite closely in the US, Professor David Strayer, has proven recently, if the voice control system is still taking the driver's mind off the road for a long period of time, because it's not intuitive, and you've got to learn a whole set of voice commands that only it can respond to, because you can't communicate with it in an intuitive way like you can with a chatbot, for example. What he actually found was that the poorly designed systems can be can create just as much trouble as visual manual interactions with some systems. And so the point I'm trying to make is that just by using your voice isn't going to solve the problem, because they'll only work if you've got a flexible error-free system that recognises your voice, that's not so error-prone, and is a little more flexible in understanding the way you talk and the way you issue your commands. Then it can be helpful. But if it's not, it'll create more trouble. And at the moment, artificial intelligence, well, as you well know, it's being used in so many different contexts, but one of the contexts in which it's being developed at the moment is making voice interactions more natural when you're speaking to your car. So in future, it's possible that, it'll be much easier to be able to do what you want, or get your infotainment system to do what you want it to do, or even your car with your voice, because the AI will make the whole dialogue more intuitive. But human factors researchers have spent at least a decade looking at how best you can design these voice command systems or voice recognition systems to, minimise cognitive distraction in this case while you're talking to the car.
So how do we know that the touch screens, phone integration, voice control, how do we know that that's actually distracting?
There are lots of different kinds of studies that have been done to determine to what extent these systems induce distraction. Some of them are experimental studies, and so I've done research in driving simulators, and so have many other colleagues around the world to understand when a driver interacts with an infotainment system or other features in vehicles, how that affects their driving performance and safety. And what people have found in these experimental studies is that, with the exception of, as I said, listening to a car radio that can be operated manually without having to look at the radio like the old style radios, and some in modern vehicles, some still have knobs and dials and things. What they generally find is that the kind of features that we've talked about do create some level of distraction, especially if, as I said before, the interaction with the systems takes the driver's eyes and mind off the road, and a hand off the wheel, especially if they take the driver's eyes off the road for significant periods of time, as I said, for 2 seconds or more, or two seconds or so in a 6-second time period, and especially if the interactions take a long time to complete. And the interactions will take a long time to complete, let's say on a touchscreen, if there are lots of interactions required, and if the interactions that are required also take a long amount of time. So the amount of time and the number of interactions is important. And David Strayer, the guy I mentioned before, the professor from the University of Utah, developed a test procedure actually in real vehicles for measuring the level of both visual and cognitive distraction produced by driver interaction with a whole range of infotainment systems. And his idea was to be able to do that so that he could compare the distractibility of the human-machine interface across vehicles. So he had a standardised procedure the idea was he could then say, well, a Ford Escort was less distracting than a Mitsubishi something. And what he did find actually was that one of the vehicles that was most distracting was either a Tesla or a Tesla-like vehicle that had the infotainment system embedded within a large central touchscreen. One of his major conclusions was that the large centralised touchscreen was one of the most dangerous things in a modern vehicle. He also found that the other things that were probably most distracting that he found were programming a navigation system while people were driving, And these are in real vehicles driven on real roads, and how we got ethics approval to do that, I'll never know. But it's quite an interesting study, which we, in fact, began replicating here in Australia because we want to do similar research here. He also found that texting and sending messages were highly distracting. And in relation to the touchscreen, it's not just touching it, but some of them allow you to use gestures to move things on the screen, to control things, sort of waving your hand basically in front of the screen, sliding your finger across the screen. I've got that in my car where, to change the fan speed of the air conditioning system, you've got to run your finger along the screen. It's sort of a slider. It's very distracting. It was much easier just to rotate a knob, and you could feel it and get feedback.
Actually, if I can just jump in there, something that happened to me recently. Hired a vehicle in Canada. I was actually driving in daytime, but there was quite a lot of smoke at the time. There were quite a lot of fires in the area where we'd been travelling, and before I left the car park, I couldn't work out how to turn the lights on. I did the, usual things that you do in the vehicle, where's everything. And I suddenly went, where's the light switch to turn the lights on? And it's normally on the stem somewhere, but it wasn't there. I pulled, obviously I hadn't left the car park yet. I looked all over the dashboard, couldn't see it. Said to my husband, oh, look, the weather looks like it's okay. I won't worry about it. Sure enough, I think we'd only travelled about 20 minutes down the road and the smoke was quite thick at one point. And I said, look, I'd rather have my lights on. Of course, had no idea how to do it. We pulled the vehicle over. It took 10 minutes, I kid you not, to find out where to turn the lights on. And it was on the screen, but it wasn't on the front of the screen like a big icon somewhere. It was embedded within it. I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever done or found. But I thought, man, if you were driving along and needed your lights urgently, even if you know where it is, you had to at least get through two screens to get there.
That's crazy, and I'm going to talk about that very shortly and what's being done at the moment to deal with exactly that issue, because you've touched on a very important point there. It's like other important functions like being able to diminish the windscreen, front and the rear screen, all of a sudden when they missed up. Sometimes it's not so easy, and it's just part of a general thrust by manufacturers to save money by incorporating more functionality into these central touchscreens, but not doing what we've been telling people to do as a human factors profession for decades now, which is, prioritise the things that are most important and give, in this case, drivers access to the ones more easily that are most important, in this case from a safety perspective. But yeah, just getting back to that work of Dave Strayer's, one interesting thing he found was that if people are particularly cognitively distracted for a long period, or if it's a very intense form of cognitive distraction, if, for example, they're sending a message that requires a lot of thinking and thought and correcting and that sort of stuff, they can remain cognitively distracted for up to 27 seconds after they finish the voice commands. So we often, think that, once the distracting episode's over, that's it. But it's a bit like when you look at an advertising billboard. If you process the content, that creates not only visual that creates cognitive distraction because you're thinking about them. And then if it's something that has meaning for you, and generally they target you with things that are meaning to most people, because they will erect these signs in areas and display things that might be most interesting to the people who live in that area, you'll continue to think about that, and that will take your mind off the road. So on average, we find that when people are highly cognitively distracted, that effect can last for about 15 seconds after the cognitive distraction. With visual distraction, when your eyes are back on the road, you fairly quickly regain situational awareness. So in a nutshell, getting back to that experimental research tells us that the most distracting interactions with these modern infotainment and other systems or features, we've called them in cars, very long visual glances, a lack of tactile feedback because you've got you're mucking around now with large central touchscreens rather than little buttons and knobs you can rotate. complex thinking, and taking a long time to complete tasks. So they're the main things. In terms of increased crash risk, not surprisingly, other studies have found that the risk of having a crash increases most when you perform things that take your eyes and your mind off the road and a hand off the wheel. So if you look at some of this naturalistic driving study I talked about before with 3,500 participants, they found, for example, that if you adjust the radio, there's a slight increase in risk, but it's very minimal. But if you start mucking around with climate controls, especially if they don't give good tactile feedback, that increases by about 2.5 times the likelihood of having a crash. With infotainment systems generally, they found there was about a 4.5 times increase in crash risk. And if you're dialing a handheld mobile phone, in that study, they found that the crash risk increased by about 12 times, so 12 times the risk of having a crash. So the sort of numbers they get correlate with what we know from experiments. We can sort of predict is likely to be the case.
So we've talked a lot about what it is. What do we do about it?
In a general sense, this comes back to the question that you asked before. If we think about distraction as a general problem, we can say there are lots of ways of dealing with it. We can train people in how to manage distraction. We can educate people about the dangers involved and the sort of things that are going to make it more likely that they will be distracted. We can introduce laws. We can increase police enforcement. These days they've got, cameras that can detect whether you're holding a mobile phone or some other device that you're not meant to be holding, for example. You can design vehicles in a way that minimises distraction, which is what I'll talk about in a moment. And what else? And you can, of course, design roads and traffic control devices to minimise distraction. I've just written a whole book on, as we discussed earlier, and this is not. That's a bit of shameless promotion, but it's a book that's about human factors in traffic engineering and road design. So it's all about what does a traffic engineer and road designer need to know from a human factors perspective, or know about human factors in optimising the design of the road, not just to minimise distraction, but to reduce confusion and reduce crashes. And you think about it, from a design perspective, let's say you've got a tourist road. What's a tourist road designed to do fundamentally?
Good point. The tourist road is so that you look at things whilst you're driving along.
Correct. And that equates to distraction. So what they do is they design a tourist road deliberately, and they market it as something pretty with ice-capped mountains or whatever, and it distracts you. And so what are you meant to do to compensate for the distraction that it causes? People put wire rope barriers to divide the roads so that if you're distracted, and we talked about running off the road, you won't collide head on. They put crash barriers on the side so you don't run off the road. They lower the speed limit to make sure that if you do crash when you're distracted, that it's a lower impact speed and causes less injury. So I'm drifting away from what the initial question was, but in terms of more broadly dealing with distraction, there are lots of different ways. But your question's about what can we do about it from a human factors and ergonomic perspective, and what have we done? There were various things that we have done as a profession in supporting and influencing designers to minimise distraction that's created by these modern vehicle features. And we've done that in various ways. One way that I've alerted our listeners to is fundamental research on what distracts drivers, how does it distract them, and by how much. And that's why I talked at the beginning of the podcast about a little bit about the theory behind it, because we only know about that theory because of this research. And so we've developed as a profession scientific methods for for measuring visual and cognitive distraction, and we've demonstrated that certain in-vehicle interactions with these features, including voice control and touchscreen interactions, impose significant visual and mental load, and hence can distract people and do distract people, and can lead to crashes. And we've also demonstrated, as I said, that that even hands-free or voice-activated systems are not, at least in current generation vehicles, distraction-free, as David Strayer in the US demonstrated. Some can impose cognitive loads as high or even higher than some visual manual interactions when you're using touchscreens. So that's the first thing. The fundamental research we've done, and that I've done myself with many international colleagues, has established why in-vehicles features of these kinds can be dangerous, and has provided, I suppose you could call an evidence base for vehicle designers to minimise distraction. The second thing we've done that has been very influential is, and possibly most influential as a profession, has been to develop design guidance, measurement methods and tools and standards for the design and evaluation of in-vehicle interfaces for these infotainment and other systems. And as a result, manufacturers have got some guidance they can go to when they're designing their vehicles to improve the design in a way that's going to not only make systems more user-friendly, but specifically to reduce distraction. Not all manufacturers use these standards in the same way, and some of them develop their own in-house guidelines to suit their own requirements. But generally these have been influential. The problem is there's no standardisation across vehicles in the way the human-machine interface is designed at the moment. Different companies like to design their gadgets in different ways, involving different interaction styles. And that's always a problem. And that's why when you hopped in that car in Canada, you couldn't find where the headlights were. Because if it was standardised, everyone would know in every car they got into how to do that. So that's the second contribution we've made. The third contribution that we've made, and this has happened over many years, is in providing guidance on the best way to design warnings, in this case from the driver support systems that we talked about before. So if they're not properly designed, if they're not timed to occur at the right time, if there are nuisance alerts, if when the lane keeping assist system intervenes, it's too aggressive in the way it pulls you back onto the road, this can not only be distracting, but it can actually encourage people to turn them off. And most of these systems can be turned off. And I can tell you, I know many people who are, well-educated, well-intentioned people who have these systems in their cars who turn them off simply because they believe they're not designed in a way that supports them, that's not annoying, and that they're not a nuisance. And so if you turn the systems off, they won't protect you. And so this is where the human factors profession is so important in making sure that we help designers to get them right so that people do use them. That usability from a safety perspective is critically important. And so, for example, work that we've done as a profession has recommended ways of selecting the most effective sensory modalities, whether it be visual, auditory or haptic, through which we, or a combination of one or more of them, when we design the warnings, to make sure that they're almost instantly recognisable without overwhelming the driver, to optimise the timing and the thresholds at which the warnings occur so that they don't occur too early, which makes them annoying, but not too late, because if they're too late, they won't be effective. And then finally, to sort of balance the rate of false alarms with what should be true rate at which these systems provide the warning, so that people aren't issued, with nuisance alerts and that people are going to ignore, and in the end, as I said, turn the system off. That's sort of a third thing that we're doing. Did you have any questions about that before I mention the last couple of ways in which
No, not directly. I was thinking alert fatigue, and I know that when you're driving a vehicle that you don't drive very often, or if you hire a vehicle particularly, and it feels like bells and whistles have gone off, you've got to try and work out what that relates to, and that is equally as distracting.
Yes, and that gets back to the whole issue of lack of standardisation in vehicles. If they were standardised, if the warning systems and the modalities through which they come through and the timing, their location, placement, all that sort of stuff was the same as it is in aircraft. In aviation, standardisation of the design of the human-machine interface is very important. And you can hop into one cockpit, because I've done quite a bit of flying as well, and you can not commercial flying or anything, but just in small aircraft. And generally the layout is similar. And even in the digital cockpits they have these days in small aircraft, it's similar, but not so yet in cars, and I'll come to that in a moment.
I'm wondering who's responsible for good design.
Ultimately, manufacturers at the blunt end are responsible for good design. If you go to, at the sharp end rather, but if you go to the blunt end, it's more than just the designers that have the responsibility for making sure that you get it right. As us as a community that has responsibility for lobbying manufacturers at the blunt end through the things that we've been talking about, and some others I'll talk about in a moment. Organisations like the Australian New Car Assessment Program, which I'm going to talk about, have a critical role to play in this, and I'll explain how. So it's not just the vehicle manufacturer, it's the people who produce the standards. It's the marketing divisions of the car companies who often persuade the people who are the designers to include things that may not be in the best interests of drivers just because they're new gadgets. If you look at the evolution of electric cars, the Tesla was probably one of the first ones to come out with this large touchscreen. So you've got like commercial imperatives to do away with buttons and knobs and that sort of stuff because touchscreens are less expensive. So lots of people have responsibility ultimately for what the human-machine interface sort of looks like in the end. But we as a profession, I think, have done a lot of things that have influenced the right people, not necessarily at the right time, because then you've got to have political will to get some of this stuff through as well. But the time, I think, is really right for us as a profession now. I think we've sort of come of age in terms of vehicle HMI design. So I'll just, if it's okay, I'll go back to where I was at in talking about some of the things that we've done and are doing that are important. Because your question, I think, was something like, what can we do?
What can we do about it?
Exactly, that was the question. One of the other things that we've done is to focus on and do research on the different interaction techniques, some of which are less distracting than others that could inform vehicle design. So we've looked, for example, at things like head-up displays and how by having a heads-up we can have things in the driver's line of sight, so there's no need to glance down and take your eyes off the road, which can be distracting. But we've also talked about the fact that inattention blindness. So, if you don't get the design of those head-up displays right, if you don't put the most critical stuff where it needs to be on the screen itself can be distracting. And then what you're doing is you're focusing on things that aren't relevant, and then you don't, through inattention blindness, see things that are actually important to see through the windscreen. So we've done research to try and get that right. And then we've done work on what we call adaptive interfaces, or what we call workload managers. And so human factors people have done research to look at how you can use information that is naturally occurring within the driving environment at a particular point in time, and use that to reduce driver workload so that people aren't distracted at the wrong time. So if you take something like a workload manager, which is a system, I suppose we'd call it an advanced driver assistance system that's already in a lot of cars actually, basic systems. If the driver's making a right-hand turn through an intersection at night time, the car will know that because the car will know that the headlights are on. It will know that the car's turning right. If it's clever, it'll know it's an intersection because it's got a digital map in it. It's night time, it's raining, so the windscreen wipers are on. It's a high workload environment. The car knows what's going on, and so the workload manager won't allow the driver to send a text or make a phone call at that time until after the car gets through the intersection. So that's a good example of an adaptive interface system that can, in this case, reduce distraction. And if someone tries to call you, the workload management system will take the call and tell the person who calls the driver's busy. He or she will call it back.
That is brilliant. Do we have that already?
Yeah, those systems are already in vehicles, and they're becoming much more sophisticated now because we now have another system called a driver state monitoring system. These are systems in most modern cars, increasingly more modern cars. In fact, they've been mandated through legislation in some countries that monitor what the driver's doing. So there are cameras inside the car. They can see, they use artificial intelligence to work out whether you're distracted, whether you're falling asleep. They fuse information from all of these other sources, whether it's day, night, what the car's doing, where it is, and they can then integrate with systems like collision warning systems and prime these systems to be ready to be activated more quickly and earlier in time because the driver state monitoring system knows that you've got a driver who's not alert and vigilant and that anything could happen. And they even, once they detect that, they can even activate things like seatbelt pre-tensioning systems that, I don't know whether you've ever felt a seatbelt pre-tensioner go off, but it really grips the seatbelt on your chest so tightly you feel like you've had the breath taken out of you. These systems do that in a crash so that the seatbelt gives you maximum protection. So the way in which we interact with the systems can determine how distracting they are, and we can develop interaction techniques and systems that reduce the distractibility of the interaction. And then finally, and actually most importantly probably, I just wanted to say that human factors work hasn't just influenced vehicle design, and it gets back to a point you made before about who's responsible for design, in this case in a vehicle. But our work has also influenced, as I said, not just vehicle design, but road safety policies, regulations, and more recently, and I'm very excited about this, new car safety ratings. I might do is just mention a couple of recent developments, if that's okay, that I think our listeners would be very interested in. Australia's got what's called a new car assessment program, which is called ANCAP. And for those of us who are familiar with it, it's Australia's independent vehicle safety testing authority. And it assesses the safety of all new cars that come onto the Australian market and assigns them what we call a star safety rating from 1 to 5. And so a 5-star car is the safest car you can buy. And it's been tested in various ways in different crash scenarios, with test dummies and all that sort of stuff. So most of us, I think, are familiar with the 5-star rating, but we may not know that it's this ANCAP organisation that does the testing. And ANCAP has announced just in the last month or so, and that's why this podcast is so timely, and I'm now speaking on the 3rd of February 2026, and it announced that from early this year, and I'd say that's probably January this year onwards, vehicle manufacturers are going to be asked to either offer physical buttons and knobs for important driver controls like the horn, the indicators, hazard lights, windscreen wipers and headlights, and that gets exactly back to the point you made. And if they don't, they have to dedicate a fixed portion of the cabin touchscreen, the one we've been talking about, to those primary driving functions. And that has come about because our ANCAP has been, I think, since 2018, been aligned with what's called Euro NCAP, which is the European New Car Assessment Program. And that's the group that has spearheaded this development and this announcement. And I'm sure that Australia is going to be following suit very shortly. And the whole idea of this development is to restrict touchscreens to secondary, non-safety critical functions and to reduce the distraction that derives from interacting using a touchscreen with those important functions and infotainment functions. And so it's a major reversal of, the industry trend toward these minimalist screens-dominated interiors of especially modern electric vehicles, and it's going to push designers to return to more tactile and ergonomic and user-friendly controls. So that's a really big and exciting development for human factors. It's the cars will now not get 5 stars if they do not get the ergonomics right. That is such an important development, and so that's why I'm so glad that this podcast is timed when it has, because I only found out about this quite recently, so very excited about that. Then in terms of driver assistance systems, these ones I talked about that have fantastic demonstrable safety benefits but can be distracting if poorly designed. ANCAP has also announced changes to the safety testing criteria to make the systems less intrusive and annoying and frustrating to drivers, so that the systems don't sound too often or inappropriately or too loudly. And from January this year, our own ANCAP's going to be penalising vehicles with driver assistance systems that do irritate rather than support the driver. So again, that's another really big win for ergonomics and human factors. And so the new test protocols are going to be rewarding driver assistance systems that not only save lives but operate intuitively without distracting or frustrating drivers. So it's another really big win for us.
That's great.
Also, they're going to be insisting that lane keeping systems we've talked about don't sort of fight the driver when we want to take back control, because some are more aggressive than others. I know that for a fact because I've driven quite a few vehicles with these systems. And again, vehicles will be penalised if the systems are too physically intrusive and will have to meet certain criteria. Another development I wanted to mention is that Euro NCAP that I mentioned before. This is the European New Car Assessment Program that we're aligned with. About 3 years ago, established what has been called the Human Machine Interface Working Group, or HMI Working Group. It's the first time that a dedicated working group has been set up to advise Euro NCAP on how to go about testing the usability of the human-machine interface in vehicles to make sure they are user-friendly and particularly designed in a way that minimises distraction. And so for me, that is a very exciting development because, as I mentioned before, I think in this podcast, for 15 years I've been trying to lobby industry and governments to encourage manufacturers to include the ergonomic assessment of the human-machine interface in vehicles as a requirement, just like other aspects of safety and safety features. So that working group developed a test protocol which is being introduced this year in Europe, and we will get it for sure very shortly. And it takes the form actually of a checklist for evaluating the placement and clarity and ease of use of essential controls, including the availability of physical buttons and commonly used functions. And for us, this is just bread and butter stuff for us in ergonomics. But finally, vehicle manufacturers now have an incentive to get this right, and in a way that will ensure that a car will not get 5 stars unless it meets the requirements I talked about before and passes the checklist test. So really important developments. And I can say that the pioneering work I've done in this area, I know it's influenced what they've done in Europe. And so along with the work that Professor David Strayer was doing, which we talked about, in evaluating those 30 different cars. So all of it has sort of come together very nicely now. And, for years we've had these guidelines and checklists available, but as I said, they're not mandatory. Manufacturers haven't actually had to use them. They've used them at their discretion. And some of them, as I said, have developed their own guidelines and standards. But now we have a real incentive through the new car assessment programs here in Australia and Europe to get the ergonomics right and to reverse that trend towards these minimalist screen-dominated interiors, especially in the new breed of electric cars, which has actually eroded the ergonomic quality of the human-machine interface in vehicles. So it's a great development. And as someone who's, I don't want to sort of become too personal about it, but as someone who's, done distraction research now for 25 years, wrote the first book on driver distraction, it's wonderful to see that in a way, distraction, as bad as it is, has been the impetus for getting good ergonomic design into these new car assessment programs. It's not just user-friendliness, but it's because they're distracting and because the human factors profession has been able to prove in what way and how distraction erodes driving performance and safety. And we have data that we've been able to influence these assessment programs in this way.
So, Mike, what is distraction going to look like as vehicles become increasingly more automated?
Well, look, that's a good question, and I'm glad that we're considering the future, because we've been talking about, current generation vehicles. But as a lot of your listeners might realise, vehicles are becoming increasingly automated. Now, at the moment, we have vehicles that sit within a taxonomy of automation, if you want to call it that are called level 2 vehicles. And my vehicle's one of those, and yours probably is too, where you can activate the adaptive cruise control and lane keeping assist at the same time, and the car will then drive itself on a freeway. If it's a Tesla, it can also overtake on a freeway by itself when it sees that there's no cars in its blind spot. But what it does require you to do is to monitor what the automation's doing, and you're still in control. And it issues you an alert every 20 seconds or so to put your hand back on the steering wheel if your hand happens to be off the steering wheel. So you're in control, and you have to monitor what the automation's doing. And you ideally should have a hand lightly on the wheel anyway. But a lot of people I haven't seen research on this, and I've done it myself. Take the hand off the wheel, because what I find is that if I do that and the car drives itself, it consumes less of my mental energy if I'm driving myself on a long trip. And the periodic warnings that you get every 20 seconds are a bit like a vigilance control system in a train. They keep you vigilant and alert. But then you go to what's called level 3 vehicles, which are a game changer. And they actually exist in a couple of countries, I think 3 countries, where the vehicle, when it's in, let's call it autopilot for the moment, the vehicle's in control. It can drive itself. And level 3 vehicles can drive themselves most of the time in most conditions. But if they can't, you have to take back control of the vehicle. And that's where the human factors distraction issue becomes a problem, because what we know from research is that when the car's in control, what are you going to do? You're not going to sit there monitoring what the vehicle's doing, because you don't have to, because you've been told that the vehicle's in control. But the problem is that when you're distracted and doing other things, we know that to regain control of the vehicle is going to be much more difficult than if you remained vigilant and were looking continuously at what the automation was doing. And so we know that when that happens, people take a long time. Well, actually not so much time to grab the steering wheel and take control, but they take a long time to get the situational awareness back, to know what to do after they've been distracted. And if they've been cognitively distracted, as we talked about before, it could take 27 seconds to know how to respond. By then they might have had the crash. So this is a massive area of research at the moment. And so it's looking at a different aspect of distraction, and through the human-machine interface, the issue is, how do you design the warnings and the human-machine interface to facilitate a rapid take-back of control? And then secondly, what can you do to support the driver to know where to look at the right time, at that moment of time, quickly, to gain situational awareness? And that brings in all sorts of interesting research that looks at augmented reality displays to show them where to look when they look back at the road scene, because the car will probably have some indication of what's going on in front, but it just can't deal with the situation. So things like that. And so I think ultimately cars that are fully automated, what we call autonomous vehicles, will be able to drive themselves. And these are what we call level 5 vehicles. Will be able to drive themselves all of the time, everywhere. And you'll be in there as a passenger. And so will that solve the distraction problem? You know, I've thought about this sort of theoretically for some time. And it probably depends on the design of the algorithms. You know, you get back to that great question you asked about who's responsible for the design of a vehicle that distracts people. If the algorithms aren't designed in a way that's going to make sure the car itself doesn't get distracted by other things going on around it, because it's going to have to now sense the road environment and detect hazards and that sort of stuff, it might get distracted by another vehicle that's behaving erratically, which is a non-autonomous vehicle. It's a human driving a manual vehicle, driving a vehicle manually. So I can't say, but the whole issue of distraction is not going to go away too quickly, I don't think. But it's still here, and even though we've done a lot, and we're at a great point in time as a profession and in influencing designers to get the design right from our perspective, there's a lot more we can do as vehicles become more automated. So it's not the end of the story.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.